Welcome back to Bayhill Studio. Today I'm going to be sewing my grandmother's Groovy Garden quilt, and this is just a modern take on the traditional grandmother's garden quilt design. And what I am using to make this quilt is my Groovy Flower Template. This template is available in my shop, and it comes in 3 sizes. You have your small, a medium size, and a large size. And these are great for making quilts, for table runners and bags. I'm going to have a lot of fun with those. But I wanted to make mine extra large in a size that was too big to fit on this paper. So what I did is I took the largest size, and when I went to print it out, I selected just that page to print. And then on the settings and the printer settings, I selected poster. And what the poster setting does is it prints out each part. It doesn't just print the center part that fits on the page and cut off the rest. It prints up each separate section on a different page that I can tape together to get this. And this is scaled at 150% of the largest flower. So this is the 100%, this is 150%. So do that to get this oversized, giant, groovy flower. And to make this quilt, I am using this beautiful Sweet Picnic collection designed by Natalia Juan Abello. I hope I said that right. For Riley Blake Designs, and I'm just in love with this. And this, I had in mind for this kind of a groovy 70s look, and that doesn't quite go with this fabric, but I didn't care. I love the picnic vibe of this fabric, and I think it's just a great pairing. So here are all my flowers all cut out, and I just wanted to show you some of these fabrics. Those cute little daisies. And we've got this lavender gingham and these purple cherry print that I'm just totally in love with. And this yellow cherry print is so cute. I love her color choices. And then she's got these supporting florals. Here's the main floral that's just really nice and large, and then this supporting floral here that's smaller and has just the sweetest little daffodils and other flowers in there. I love this red, and here's a cream and a cream cherry. Just all these great prints. Here's a cute little bicycle print, and here's a little aqua blue daisy. And then we've got this tonal butterfly print that's so sweet. So, and then the aqua and red gingham, just so sweet. So I'm in love with all of it. And I'm going to start you off. Oh, and then for the template, we also cut out the flower centers. And what I did is as I cut out each flower, I just cut out a center for each print also. And then what we'll be doing is we'll be just mixing and matching the centers with the different prints, kind of like that. So I'm going to show you how we're going to get started. So to get started, this is put together differently than a regular quilt. It's more like a puff quilt in that you have a layer of muslin or any fabric that you don't care about, because this fabric is not going to be seen. This is basically the back of the quilt top. And it's just holding all my stitching in place for the quilt top. And then your batting is going on top of that. So normally we have the batting under the quilt top. Here the batting is part of the quilt top. So I've laid this out, and I've cut this, sewn 2 pieces of muslin together here, and now it's cut to a square of about 63 inches square. You can cut it to whatever size you want. I wanted a nice size throw quilt. And then I'm putting my batting right on top. Now for the muslin, if you don't want to use muslin, you can use an old sheet that's just, had seen its day. Any fabric that you don't want, this again will not be seen ever. So just make sure you don't care about whatever fabric's on the back there. And then you've got your muslin on top, or your batting on top. And then what we do is we just start placing flowers and layering them around. And let's see, so here's an example. what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this all out on my floor. So I'm just going to give you a small example here. And I'm going to do 2 or 3 rows and pin them into place. I'm not going to do the whole quilt because I'm afraid as I sew, I'm going to just lose control of the design. So 2 to 3 rows, if that, just little pieces at a time. I'm going to play it by ear. I might even just do one little section and work my way out. In fact, now that I'm saying that out loud, I probably will do that. And then you're going to kind of layer the flowers over each other so that you don't have gaps. However, if you end up with a gap, so let's get another one here, and you've laid it out and you just don't see a way to avoid having a whole show. So here we go. We've got a little hole showing right there. So I have this texture fabric from Sandy Gervais, and any coordinating fabric would do. And I'm going to be cutting off little pieces, and I'm just going to place them underneath, and it becomes the background. So that will just go under all of the layers like that. And then as I stitch these in place, I'm just going to have that under there, and it will naturally get stitched in place. So it's just a nice filler for when you need a background to fill that gap. So what I'm going to do is go lay this out and just get a section pinned, and then we'll start sewing. It on the corner of the quilt, and I'm just going to show you what I did. So I went ahead and layered the muslin, the batting, and then I set the first corner, pinned it in place really good, and then I have done a satin stitch around it. And I am the most impatient quilter there is, and so a lot of my stitching isn't a true satin stitch. It's a little wider, and I'm totally fine with that. You might want to take your time if you care more about it looking super pretty. Here, I can show you more of my stitching here. Not super pretty, but I'm so okay with that. So another option for this is kind of a quilt-as-you-go method. Another option for it, if you don't want to do the satin stitch, is to hand turn all of these pieces. Guys, I have no time for that. It's not going to happen. But if you wanted to really take your time, you could do that. So I started with this one, stitched it down, and then you'll see I put in some of the texture fabric here as a little background, and I find that I need it more around the edges than I have needed it so far in the middle. And then I just layered on, after I did this one, I layered on this one and then this one, and now I'm ready to do these two. And what I find is that doing 2 at a time is all I can manage. And I say that because this is a throw size, and it gets really bulky as I have to turn it, maneuver it in and around my machine as I go around the flower. You're turning the entire quilt basically as you stitch. If you do more, you're going to lose control. As I said earlier, they'll be falling out and falling out of place. So just keep it really small. Just work 1 or 2 at a time. I like to do 2 at a time because then I can position these to make sure that I don't have a gap, or that if I do have a gap, I've placed some background fabric. So it's just to make sure that everything's where it needs to be. And I'm using a lot of pins here. Now this is the layer that I'm going to sew first, and then this flower because it's on top. And to keep this out of the way, I'm going to pull this back and just pin it there so that it's out of the way of this one and it doesn't get caught in there. Then I'll add another pin. And the reason why I'm using lots of pins, which I don't usually do, is because of all the turning that happens. I don't want it to get too bunched up as I sew and out of place. And so I'm going to go ahead and stitch these 2 to show you how exactly that happens. And we'll just keep working on this beautiful little quilt. Okay, you may notice that my machine is different than the one that I usually use. I normally use just my Juki straight stitch machine for quilting, but because I needed a satin stitch, I pulled out my 15-year-old brother machine. And this is not my favorite machine to use. because I love my Juki so much, but this has stitch options. So I've set a zigzag stitch at 3.5 millimeters width, and the length I have it at 3 millimeters. And if I were you, I would just take a little piece of fabric, and like I did, let's see, pull that thread off, which I did here. Took a little scrap fabric and just test stitches till you get the width and length that feels good to you. All right, and what I can see here is I have extra inches that I don't need to sew, and so I'm going to start this flower actually where the muslin starts, because I actually sewed or cut the batting wider than the muslin. So I'm going to start right about here. And because we're doing this stitch through batting, it does tend to get kind of stuck. And so I just find myself gently pulling as I go. So here we go. Okay, so we finished this flower right here, you can see, and now I can unpin this part that I folded back and let it cover the area that it's supposed to cover, and then we'll sew that part into place. So I don't know if you noticed when I was sewing this cream flower into place how much I actually had to maneuver the batting and the rest of the quilt around. Seeing that, I really do not recommend creating a quilt larger than a throw size. This is a generous throw size, and it's quite the effort to work it around this machine. So that's my recommendation. If you want to go for it, of course, go for it. The other thing that I did with this cream flower is I took more time with the satin stitching on areas that I think are going to be seen. And then the parts that are going to be covered up, I just kind of rushed through those and didn't worry if they looked super neat. So it's my little cheat sheet right there. So now let's get this flower sewn on, and then we'll take a look. Okay, so this is what I have done so far, and now I'm going to start, I'm going to add 2 more flowers. So I've decided I'm going to add this little flower right here, and I'm not going to have any open space in the background. So I'm going to pin that in place. And another option, if you want it really crisp and flat, this isn't perfectly crisp, as you can see. It has definitely a homegrown look to it. You can use a product like Heat and Bond and just press all of these in place beforehand, and then you've got that. So that's another option. I really want this to have like a vintage, retro kind of feel, and to me I just need it to look just really natural, handmade, and not super crisp. So that's what I'm going for here, but that is definitely an option. Okay, so I put this down. If you'll notice, all of these were put down first, then these 2. And so I wanted to change it up a little bit. So I'm putting this one down first, and then I'm going to add this on top. So it's just a little bit changed up, alternating the way that goes. And then let me see. I've got all these cute circles, and let me just see what hasn't been added. And what I do like to do is, if I've got more of a main print, like these tonal ones are to me more of a supporting background print, so is the gingham. And so if I've got something a busier main print, then I want to try to use one of the supporting prints for contrast, just to kind of keep balance. So I'm going to pin that in place, and then what I need to do is see how I'm doing with the muslin. This is already stitched down, so I really don't want to be adding background fabric. So I'm going to get this situated. There we go. That's perfect. And I won't need any background fabric up there. So this worked out really nicely, and I'm just pinning this again a lot, but once again, this piece is coming down. I'm sewing this one on first, so I'm going to pin this back and out of the way, and I'm actually going to put 2 pins just to make sure it stays put. So then next I'm going to go ahead and sew this and that, and then I just keep going from there. Okay, so I put you on time lapse for a little while, and you can see it's just around and around, sewing in circles basically. A couple of things. What I did start doing is just preemptively adding some texture here and there. Whether or not I know I need it, it's better to be safe. There was this part right here. I ended up needing it, and so I ended up unpicking this and adding it. And so down here I just added some, and I may or may not need it when I add the next flowers. But we've got a corner done. It's a little bit slow going because the satin stitch does take a while, so I'm just going to keep at it. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is at the end, this is kind of cool on the back, you can see all of that stitching. When it's done, you have a couple of ways to quilt this. You're going to add fabric for the quilt back, and if you want it extra thick, if you don't just want one layer of batting, you can add another layer of batting and then the fabric, like a traditional, how you would sandwich a traditional quilt. But you do have this layer of batting, so if you just wanted to add fabric to the back and have this be a normal thickness, a traditional thickness of quilt with just one layer of batting, you can do that too. When you add that fabric to the back, you're still going to want to quilt it. So you have a couple of options. One way to go, if you wanted to keep that really retro feel to the quilt, is to get yarn and tie at the center of each flower. That would be so fun. Thinking about it as I was sewing along, in the interest of time, I will be just taking the yellow thread and going over it around the outline where it's already had a satin stitch. I'm just going to quilt around that, and it will barely be visible, if at all. But the reason why I want to do that is because I want to keep this loose, the flowers and this quilting really loose. I really like that. It just reminds me of growing up, that just homemade 70s vibe to this quilt. So I'm not going to add any more quilting besides what's already here. So I'll just be following these lines. The other thing that would be fun, if you wanted, is you could hand stitch around the outline of each flowers, just hand quilt, and that would be charming. So I'm just going for more authentic 70s, and I just want this loose and homemade feeling. I just want it to feel like, you know, we're stepping back in time. And even these colors I think are pretty perfect. The prints are maybe a bit more modern than you would see in the 70s, but not too bad. I think it's pretty cool. So there's a peek at our grandmother's groovy garden, and I'm just going to keep at it, and I will give you a peek as I make more progress. So I'm at a point where I have a large section completed. All of these flowers sewn together, and I think they're adorable. And I just want to show you another way that's kind of a shortcut that you might like to try, because it does take a long time to stitch around each and every flower. So something that you can do is lay out a whole section. So right here, I started up here, and I'm kind of going down this whole side section. And what I'm going to do, and I found this to be really a nice little shortcut. This saves me from having to go around all these parts that aren't going to show. I don't have to stitch around them if I take this little shortcut. So I'm going to start at the top here, and I'm going to stitch, and I'm going to follow it down, and then I'm just going to continue on to this flower, and I'm going to keep going down. And I already can see where I have patches that I need to fill in with the background, with this texture fabric, with the background fabric. So I'll fill those in before I get to those parts. And I'm just going to keep going down and kind of follow this side, and then work my way back up and just sew around all of the exposed edges. And I'm not having to sew all these parts that are underneath that I will never see. And it's kind of nice. I did that with a section here as an experiment, and it worked great. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start here, work my way down this side, then just kind of work my way up, and then fill in wherever I need to. So if I get to, say, this part, I've sewn here and along here, and then I've come back and I've sewn along here. Well, I've got this little part that needs to be sewn, and I can just come back in and do that later and fill in all those little spots that maybe I missed as I was going up and down the rows. And I'm not going to lay out the entire quilt, but I will lay out a section, a bite-sized section, kind of 2 flowers thick, 2 rows thick of flowers to tackle. And it saves a lot of time, and it saves a lot of thread. This does use up a lot of thread for sure. And so that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to continue on in that way. I want to show one more tip. So we basically talked about 3 ways to sew these flowers on. The first way is to sew around the entire flower using the satin stitch. And then the second way was I did over here, and it was to layer them a row or 2 of flowers and just sew around the perimeter and just over the visible sides. Continuing with that second method, I do recommend safety pinning instead of using regular pins. So as I have been maneuvering this quilt around the machine, I don't know why it took me so long to figure out, but as I was using regular pins, sewing pins, they would fall out or they would poke my hands, and it was just kind of difficult. And so I decided to just safety pin these in place. That way I can hold a couple of rows of flowers in place, and at the same time, they're not going anywhere. They're going to stay put. So I think that's going to be the best bet, is just safety pin those flowers in place and just get going. So for here, I'm going to start, I'll probably put one more flower over here so I'm closer to the edge, and then I'm going to start and just come around this side. And when I get to this purple flower, I can either go here and stop there, or I can continue just around and go along down the row and then come back along the other side, get this side, and then later fill in these parts in between. And then I'll come back and do the centers. So if you wanted to make it easier on yourself, you could, again, do the fusible adhesive, like heat and bond for the centers. You could do it for the entire flower. It would just be kind of cost prohibitive doing an entire quilt with that. But the centers, it might be nice to hold them in place. I just don't want to mess with it. I just want to keep on going, and I just don't want that extra step. But there's certainly nothing wrong with doing that, and it might make your life a lot easier. So almost done with this. I'm just going to keep on going and show you the finished quilt. Okay, I have the entire quilt top finished, all the applique done, and I do have to say that using the safety pins was awesome. I ended up just pinning in place the whole rest of the quilt. All of the flowers were pinned in place, and I was able to just zip through. So I do recommend just using safety pins and getting a lot of them done at once. So with that being done, this is the top layer. It's got all of the fabric from the flowers, plus that quilt batting, plus the muslin or just whatever fabric backing. And that's normally a typical quilt, and that's a nice thickness for a thin, traditional thin quilt. I decided that I'm going to add an extra layer of batting before I add the quilt back. So you can just stop here. You've got these layers, and then add your quilt back without that extra layer of batting and quilt them all together. And I'll tell you the reason why I decided to do that. So if you take a look at these flowers, let me see if I can get, well, this pin came undone. If you take a look at these flowers, they're quite puffy. So there's a couple things going on here. When you applique these flowers, like I did, just loose, without using heat and bond or anything, they're going to be a little more loose and puffy when you finish. And I like that. That's what I was going for. If you want them just, like I said earlier, crisp and flat, I would use something like heat and bond so that they're just flat to the surface. I wanted this very retro looking, and I wanted a puffier, looser homespun look. So with that puffiness, I wanted to kind of accentuate it. So I thought one more layer of batting will just give me, once I quilt around the flower petals, it'll just give me a little more puff to those flowers. That's what I'm hoping for. And I also want to restate that when I quilt, I am just going to use my free motion foot, and I'm going to go all around all the areas where I appliqued around all the edges of the flowers. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is because I don't want quilting to show all over, but another benefit of that is, again, these flowers are very puffy, and just loose, I guess is the best way to describe it. So if I were to do any other quilt design like straight lines or an all over type design, this fabric would end up getting bunched up like this. So I'm going a straight line and it's going to get bunched, and I'll end up with a lot of creases, and it would kind of spoil the design of this quilt. And so I'm not going to mess with the flower petals in any way with the quilt design. Now, it would look really lovely if I hand quilted. That wouldn't do any of the creasing like I just mentioned. So some hand quilting around the edges would be nice, but I'm just going to take some yellow thread and go right over it, and you'll hardly ever, might not even see it. And that's it. I've got my quilt back on. This is a lovely print from the Blossom Basics from Riley Blake Designs. I'm not sure which color it is, some shade of purple. And so I thought it went perfectly with this Sweet Picnic collection. I just love it. So I'm going to get started. We'll get this quilted, and then we'll get the binding on, and it'll be ready to go. The Granny's Groovy Garden quilt is finished. 2 layers of batting thick. And I added the second layer to hopefully add some extra kind of puff and body to these flowers. And I don't think it really made a difference. They look the same as they did to me with just the 1 layer of batting. The second layer does make it more heavy, which would make it great for more of a winter blanket. This is more of a summer blanket, so I could have done without the extra layer of batting. So just so you know. And then I wanted to show you close up how I quilted it. I just went around straight stitch with my free motion presser foot, and on my machine I just straight stitched a couple of times around each circle, and I straight stitched 1 time around, and sometimes a couple times if I had to backtrack, but just right on top of my satin stitching. And so it's mostly invisible except where I went off, like here, which is totally fine. I wasn't worried about that at all. I wasn't trying to be perfect with it. So that's how I decided to quilt it. So the quilting is actually just invisible. You can't see it because it blends right in with that satin stitching. So I am super happy with it. I was talking to a couple of friends yesterday. One friend suggested that another option for the applique that would be really easy would be just to straight stitch 3 times around the edge. So 1 time really close to the edge and then 2 times a little closer in, just really close to the edge. That would be really fun and much easier. I will say the satin stitch takes up a lot of thread. And I wanted to also show you, let's see if I can find, okay, so right here, I was using quilting thread, a really good quality quilting thread, and you can see it's such a fine quilting thread that it's hard to see, and there's a lot more gaps in it. It's just really fine, and you can see all the spaces in there. And then I ran out and I didn't have time to order more. And so I switched to just a cheap, I'll show you, just serger thread. And look at the difference. So let's hold it up side by side. Here's the difference. The cheap thread fills in the gaps so much more. These were the exact same color thread, but this one is just heftier, fills in the gaps more. And so if you're doing the satin stitch, I do recommend this. Another friend had the suggestion of just letting the satin stitch be on the quilt back. So your quilt back, instead of muslin, you would use your actual quilt back, and the satin stitch would show and it would make a pretty design. And so if you're taking your time and doing a really pretty satin stitch, that's a great option, is just making a regular quilt sandwich and just letting the satin stitch be the back of your design. My quilt back is so messy, you guys. I didn't take time to bury my stitches, so I have knots, and oh, what a mess. But I was in quite a hurry making this, and I still love it. My daughter just loves it. She thinks this is her absolute favorite quilt. So it's just a fun, cute, cozy quilt. So there's a couple of ideas. I do suggest using safety pins to just pin it all in place. And if you want to simplify, don't do the muslin backing, just do a regular quilt back, and you can let your satin stitch show right through if you want to do that. If you want it more subtle like that, then by all means do the muslin, and you can for sure add that second layer of batting like I did. If you're doing that, maybe you want more fall, winter type themed fabrics, because that will make it so much warmer. And honestly, one of the complaints in my family with my quilts is that they're not warm enough. So they're going to love this, actually. I have to say, I can't wait to wash this up and get it all nice and crinkly and soft and ready to use. So I hope you enjoyed this. You can find the Granny's Groovy Garden template in my shop at bayhillstudio.com. And with that template, again, you just blow it up to 150% for this quilt. But I will be making many more projects using these cute flowers with that template. So look forward to that. And I hope you enjoyed this. And please like and subscribe, and have a blessed day.